We are going to hear from Jonathan Blackwell, Product Manager at Imanami. Jonathan, take it away.
I am Jonathan Blackwell, Product Evangelist at Imanami. The basis for both productivity and security starts with groups. So let's talk about some best practice to remediate some of these problems. First of all, you need to reduce the total number of groups. Quite often we've encountered customers or prospects of ours that had a magnitude of groups greater than the number of users in the organization. Of course, every organization is a little bit different, but you need to make sure that groups do not outlive their purpose, that there is a life cycle applied to them that at the end of their purpose will automatically expire and remove unnecessary groups. And just through attrition alone, by the inaction of users who let a group come up for review and have and don't apply any attention to it, that those groups are safely expired and become unusable for security vectors. An unused group over a period of time can also be safely deleted. Group membership should be automated. That's both adding groups in a timely manner, adding membership, in a timely manner to groups, and then remove them immediately when they no longer need access. Adding them based on criteria using the source of intelligence in your organization that includes role-based information, attributes associated with the users, attributes associated with the work that they're working on, the project database, etc. Leveraging all the intelligence in the organization to determine membership ensures that they are productive, ensures that they get access to the resources they need in a timely manner. And perhaps more importantly, is that they are removed from said groups and removed from having access to things that they no longer need access to. Even when somebody moves laterally within an organization, that's true. And then the next important best practice is to delegate with oversight. Sometimes IT workers, in spite of the well-known practice of delegation, some of them are afraid to do so because there is a fear that a non-technical worker wouldn't understand the implications of making a change in the directory. No one is implying that they be given administrative rights or have that type of control over the organization. But within the narrow scope of their job function, it gives them the ability to choose which people and which resources are impacted by these rule changes, to delegate just enough authority to them so that they can perform that action instead of you. That is definitely a best practice. Pull yourself out of the loop. And you can always add layers of security on top of that process, including building in workflows so that you get the final say. And gate the access to such important tasks with things like multi-factor authentication. And then perhaps one of the most overlooked best practices is to enforce temporary membership by policy. In other words, whether a group is automated or not, whether it's delegated or not, that every single membership change is automatically applied with its own lifecycle policy so that membership is always temporary. And simply, even if the design is to be perpetual, that temporary membership just basically means that you have ongoing attestation, that someone is always rubber stamping that perpetual user, that there's always an access review going on. You pick the timing based on the sensitivity of that particular task. At the root of it all is lifecycle, and that's lifecycle in everything. Frequently, people will talk about attesting to groups, attesting to membership, etc., but it by itself is not enough. It's a good start. And the reason why it's not enough is because attestation is just a check mark. Enforcement is really key. And by applying a true lifecycle policy to groups and to membership, then you can intelligently expire groups. You can intelligently expire them because you can gauge how often, how frequently a group is being used. You can gauge what type of membership is included therein, and then automatically have groups, their life extended or contracted based on those particular policies. Expiration eventually leads to deletion. So an expiration is a really super soft delete, so you don't lose any security principles with it, but it effectively makes it unusable. And then after a period of time, you can have additional policies put in place, where expired groups would eventually be logically deleted from the directory. This two-step process, built in with automation and with oversight, ensures that groups and membership don't outlive their purpose. Attrition in this process reduces the number of groups over time, and it really improves the security profile of the organization as a result. And because groups are expired as opposed to logically deleted, then rescue of those particular groups when it's found out that there is an actual business need is easily performed without disruption to the organization. So if you've ever had that thought, I can't delete a group because I'm not sure what business process is going to break, an expired group and applied lifecycle will remediate that thought. The next is to apply this to all types of groups and lists. That would be your distribution list, your distribution groups, security groups, your Microsoft Teams and their associated channels. Apply it to your local and cloud storage access. Applying it globally across your organization ensures that Lifecycle is continually reducing the risk, it's continually narrowing the scope of potential vectors for hackers to navigate your organization. Very important process. And we like to look at the three primary mechanisms in which a group is used, and to have lifecycle policies and approval processes every step of the way. That goes from creation to deletion, the permissions associated with that particular group object, and of course the membership therein. So everything should have a lifecycle. And one of the best things that you can do to reduce the amount of work that your organization does, and even that for which is delegated, is to automate as many processes as possible. Because humans are really weak decision makers. There is a typical assumption that if a business stakeholder just leans their shoulder a little bit, or leans their head on the shoulder of an IT worker to get things done, if an organization just puts in a help desk ticketing system so that someone with technical intelligence can actually do the work, that's just asking for trouble. Because again, you're deferring from one human being to perhaps somebody else with a slightly better understanding of the technical implications in making that decision, but you're also moving that decision-making process away from the business side of the organization, and so there's a disconnect frequently. And human beings, in the name of efficiency and productivity, will err on the side of said efficiency and productivity and will just enable things. There's no closed loop when it's no longer needed. When there is a new employee, for example, there's a hiring manager that is probably yelling at the top of their lungs to get someone provisioned, to get them access to the resources that they need. But there isn't that closed loop. When they move laterally within the organization, there's not somebody typically calling you and say, hey, by the way, so-and-so is no longer needed in our accounts payable department. They've moved on to some other area in finance, so they no longer need access to that particular application, those files, etc. And so there's no oversight given there. And so as someone moves laterally within the organization, the amount of keys that they have grows exponentially. Instead, we recommend, and as a noted best practice, is to use all your sources of intelligence. So that would include directory attributes wherever they exist, whether on-prem, in the cloud, perhaps both at the same time. Your human resource data, because quite often some of that information is important for decision-making processes, but it's not a good idea to replicate that data in a public directory. So there might be really valuable details that exist in an HR sense, but shouldn't be consumed someplace where it can be easily read. Project data is often used by our clients where they're managing particular projects, and they might have a complicated Gantt chart, and based on where they are in the project lifecycle, they can have access granted and pulled away based on that information. And there's other types of data that exists in other directories, etc., that might help determine the overall intelligence you have about your staffing, about the contributors, your contractors, etc. And automating as much as possible the permissions, the entitlements they receive as a result of membership in groups is key and to leveraging all of that data. And then where you can't always automate, you need to delegate. And that means delegation outside of the IT organization. Delegating to your staff, because number one, it'll reduce the workload of your IT staff. As mentioned before, the IT department is quite often the least likely to know the business use cases. They're the least likely to understand the intricacies of that particular line of business that requires access to certain applications, certain resources, etc. When you combine delegation with automation, really becomes a high-level best practice, because you can automate to a great extent, but still have those edge cases where delegation is still key, whether that be a person to self-identify they need access when they don't quite meet the criteria, and allow someone to join or leave a group, to have an owner or manager, or a department head, etc., to make that, that determination outside the scope of automation. By combining those two components together really makes delegation very powerful. So you can still have a high degree of automation, and when necessary in delegation, it doesn't disrupt or break that automation. There's always those edge cases, and a well-crafted delegation tool knows how to work within the automation confines. Another important part of delegation is to implement workflow so that you get that peace of mind on the more sensitive areas of the organization, that just-in-case checking, so that somebody, whether it be a business stakeholder, an IT person, or perhaps both, that they can have that final approval, that final yes or no answer in terms of a change. By implementing workflow for super sensitive processes should be a part of the things that you consider when implementing your delegation tools for directory changes. And it's also important to establish a purpose and a reason, to understand how and where things are being used. In other words, if you are going to delegate, for example, the capability for a business stakeholder to review membership in a group, or even the group itself, they're looking at Lifecycle, for example, it's important to know how that group is being used, and to bubble up that information, to expose them to how frequently, where that group is being used, really adds the capability, it really adds power to their decision-making process. So it's not just good enough to say group XYZ is up for review, attest to it, but you need to know when was the last time that group was used, where was it used, where is it being used right now, what permissions is being granted as a result of this group existing in the directory, et cetera, et cetera. So important part of the delegation process in terms of visibility. And perhaps one of the most overlooked best practices is to implement temporary membership. Some people try to accomplish this by having this being a part of their attestation process, but without computer involvement, there's always going to be something that slips through the cracks. And so if you have a system that can, by policy, implement temporary membership, then you're golden. Deploying join and leave capabilities that mentioned earlier in the delegation process is really just the start. You really need to create policies, especially for your sensitive groups, so that temporary membership is implemented almost always. You can apply the policies across the entire organization to specific organizational units based on type, location, tenant, etc. But the great benefit of temporary membership by policy, even for automated groups, is that you're basically ensuring that someone has to evaluate, even though it's automated membership, someone has to rubber stamp and continue to attest and validate that that particular membership, that particular member needs to be there. Otherwise, they're removed. Even if they match criteria, for example, they can be removed. So temporary membership by policy ensures that there's no accidental leakage, and that's especially important for groups that grant elevated permissions within the organization.
Perfect. Those are great resources. Thank you so much for sharing them, Jonathan.